Hello, welcome back to video number 30. Today we're diving right back into modeling more of those engine parts. First things first, let's bring up the Gizmo. Then head on over to the gear and choose the poly plane. Now press Unify, then press Grid Divide. This helps us add edge loops pretty fast. Next up, let's run a Polish by Features. Now grab the Move Infinite Depth brush and start shaping the form. Switching gears a bit, let's pull out the ZModeler brush and extrude some edges. Once we have them extruded, it's time to move them into place with the ZModeler brush again. Here's where the Ryan Tools plugin comes in handy. Just press the extrude button, which gives us the freedom to use the morph slider to adjust the thickness. Press QC50, and let's make a few more adjustments with our Move Infinite Depth brush. Finally set the crease level to 3. And then one more time with the ZModeler brush, let's make some crease modifications. It's all about refining and adjusting as you go. Let's select Inset for the polygon action and pick Flat Island for the target. And then isolate the top poly group and press Ctrl-Shift-S to shrink that selection. Now press Ctrl-W to group visible. Next, let's go ahead and Q-mesh the poly group island. Snap to the side view, unmask the top faces, and move them down with the Gizmo. Control and move with the Gizmo to extrude the faces. Then scale them inwards. Let's grab the Slice Curve brush, then adjust the points around using the move action from the ZModeler brush. After that, Q-mesh the poly group island. Then unmask the poly group island and clip it down. Let's reposition your points and press Ctrl-W to group visible. Choose Crease Edge Loop Partial and set up some creases. Now take the Move Infinite Depth brush for a spin and make some adjustments. Let's bring back the Slice Curve brush to add an edge loop. Collapse that edge down and press Ctrl-W to group visible. At this point, we can delete the extra edge. Then add a few more edge loops with the Slice Curve brush to help control the shape. You can alt tag the top faces to poly group, then unmask the top poly group. Click on Mask by Features and run a Polish by Features to space out your topology. The Move Infinite Depth brush is excellent for adjusting the shape of the top border. At this stage, don't worry about the topology edge flow. It might look a bit rough, but that won't matter because we're planning on DynaMeshing it soon. Let's go ahead and add another edge loop with the Slice Curve brush. Then group visible with Ctrl W. Now we want to select Polygroup Flat Island. Unmask the polygroup next. It's time to bring up the gizmo and press Y to switch to the transpose line. Snap it to the side and draw out the line. Then bring back the gizmo to adjust the height. Lastly, let's do a bit of point adjustments with the ZModeler brush. If there are a lot of adjustments to make, I usually switch to the Move Infinite Depth brush. It just feels more comfortable to me. But as always, use what works best for you. Let's bring up the gizmo, and from the gear, we're going to pick Cylinder 3D. Now invert the mask and split unmasked points. Then press Unify and QC50. It's time to scale and move it into position. Let's unmask the bottom, move it up, and scale it up. Go ahead and use our Move Infinite Depth brush to reposition those bottom edges. Now we can turn off Dynamic and add in an edge loop. We're going to bring those edges in a bit with the Move Infinite Depth brush. Go ahead and apply dynamic subdivisions for both subtools. Then we can merge the subtool down and delete the lower subdivision. Let's run a DynaMesh utility with a poly count of 1,000,000 Now smooth out some of those transitions and run a polish to smooth out the edges. Grab the trim hole brush and set the focal shift to -99. You can always use the adjust last slider to give it a little bit more strength. You can even trim a hole on a plane chain. Let's amp up the strength with the adjust last slider. Next, let's DynaMesh and smooth out the inner hole. Don't forget to run a polish. Now we can mask the model, bring up the gizmo, and from the gear, select the cylinder 3D again. Let's set the H divides to 100 this time. Then scale it and move it into position. Mask the top polys and give the bottom a bit of a scale adjustment. After clearing the mask and running a DynaMesh, it's time to polish it up and check out how it looks. If it's not quite looking right, no worries. You can undo a bit and make some adjustments to the bottom of the cylinder. After clearing the mask and running a DynaMesh, polish it up and see how it looks. It's all about making adjustments until it works. Let's start by bringing up the gizmo and selecting Cylinder 3D from the gear. Invert that mask and split the unmasked points. Scale and move the cylinder into place. Hold Ctrl and move with the gizmo to make a duplicate. Let's clear the mask and clip the cylinders up. Now we can merge the subtool down, DynaMesh, and then give it a polish. The mask curve brush will come in handy for masking out the bottom. We'll be using the Clip Circle Center brush to carve in some cool insets. When you're pressing Ctrl, Shift, and Alt, make sure the plus symbol, which is in the middle, is outside of any unmasked geo. Clear that mask and run another DynaMesh. Now we can use the trim brush to clean up those edges. Go ahead and select the Move brush to finesse the shape. Then run a polish. Grab the planer brush to flatten out the top of the cylinders. Bring up the Gizmo again and select Cylinder 3D from the gear. Press Unify and set the H divides to 24. Scale it in the Z-axis and turn on Symmetry in the Z-axis. Let's set the radial count to 6. Next up, grab the Clip Curve brush. Then we can press Group by Normals and select the 24 sides IMM. Let's press Group Normals again and delete the extra edge loops. Now Q-mesh the poly loop. Q-mesh the polygroup island. Polygroup the poly loop. Then isolate the polygroup in the middle and press Auto Groups. Feel free to throw in some edge loops. Let's mask the interior polys, then run a Polish by Features. Once that's done, press QC50. Q-mesh the outside poly loop, then delete every other edge loop. Q-mesh the outside poly loop once more to make it just a bit larger. Let's select the Cylinder 3D from the Gizmo's gear, set the H divides to 32, and move the white cone to 0.7. Go ahead and scale it down on the Z-axis. For our polygroup action, we're going to go with Inset, and for the target, we're choosing Polyloop. Then insert an edge loop right down the middle. Next, we'll turn on Symmetry in the Z-axis, setting the radial count to 8. From there, pick Split Point and tap Alt to switch up the polygroup. Let's switch over to Inset Polygroup All now. Select Q-mesh Polygroup All and hold the Shift key to move. After that, Q-mesh Polygroup All again, but this time to extrude. Use Q-mesh Polyloop with the Shift key for another move. Then scale the outer edge loop. Time to press QC50 and crease PG. Set the crease level to 2 and insert a couple of edge loops to help our creasing. Let's mask the model and once more bring up the Gizmo. From the gear, select Cylinder 3D. Adjust the white cone to 0, then invert the mask and split the unmasked points. Adjust the scale and set the H divides to 24. Time to turn on symmetry in the Z-axis again, but this time, set the radial count to 6. Now we can grab the clip curve brush and scale it on the Z-axis. Next we'll need the 24 sides IMM. Make sure to drag the Mesh Fusion brush onto the polygroup island. Press Group by Normals to assign those polygroups. Then let's go ahead and delete the extra edge loops. We'll Q-mesh the poly loop twice, then transpose the edge loop and move it up. Let's go ahead and Q-mesh the poly loop twice again. Next we'll polygroup the middle faces, unmask them and extrude them down with the Gizmo. Let's go ahead and throw in a few edge loops. Then select Polygroup Flat Island from the ZModeler brush. Mask the edge loop complete and run a Polish by Features. Now unmask the edge loop and run a Polish by Features. Then scale it out just a touch. Press QC50. Scale it and move it into position. Let's go ahead and add an edge loop on the outer poly loop. Once you've finished your adjustments, merge the subtool down and press Ctrl W to group visible. Let's start by grabbing the mask curve brush to set up our masking. Then use Ctrl W to group our mask. After that, we'll duplicate the subtool. We need to isolate the poly group and then delete hidden. Now unmask the borders and run a Polish by Features to smooth those edges out, getting it ready for ZRemesher. We'll set the target poly count for ZRemesher to 0.5 and then adjust the adaptive size to 0. Let's grab the Gizmo and set up our symmetry before we run ZRemesher. From the gear, we'll select Remesh by ZRemesher. The red cone is for symmetry in the x-axis. Slide it over. But remember, this is based on the Gizmo's orientation, not the world's. The white cone, let's set that to 50. Go ahead and press Accept to lock in these settings. Grab the Move Infinite Depth brush and use local symmetry to adjust the topology. Let's split the point unmask it, run a polish by features and scale everything back up. We'll then inset polygroup all and delete the middle polygroup. Now let's project the mesh with a distance of 0.02. Slide the edges and then press project all. Time to select insert. Go with multiple edge loops with interactive elevation and run another project all. Let's extrude all the polygons. And then select slide edge loop complete to create a bevel. Then crease the poly loop. Let's also crease the corners. Turn on dynamic and set the crease level to 3. Bringing up the Gizmo again, from the gear, select Cylinder 3D. Set the H divide to 24 and scale it out on the Z axis. Press Group by Normals and choose the 24 sides IMM. Delete the extra edge loops and inset the polygroup island. Turn on symmetry in the x-axis and alt tag these faces to QMesh. Unmask the polys and scale them down. Press QC50 and set up the creasing. Set the crease level to 3. Now we can add in some support loops. From the ZModeler brush, switch to Insert Multiple Edge Loops. Adjust the thickness of the ends with the QMesh flat island. Now we can select Slide Edge Loop Complete. QMesh the polygroup island while holding Shift. Let's add in an edge loop on both ends. Now we can crease the poly loops. Turn on dynamic and set the crease level to 2. Time to mask the model and again bring up the Gizmo. Select Cylinder 3D from the gear. Now if scaling the model causes them to merge toward the center, you want to turn on local symmetry and uncheck dynamic. Mask the top of the cylinder and move it down. Then select Crease Edge Loop Complete. Add in some edge loops and don't forget to add an edge loop at the caps as well. Bring up the Gizmo and select Cylinder 3D from the gear. Press Unify and set the H divides to 32. Switch to the side view and scale the whole thing on the Z axis. Next, we're going to want to press Group by Normals. Grab the 32 sides IMM. Now switch back to the ZModeler brush and remove the extra edge loops. Press Ctrl W to group visible. Now it's time for some ZModeler. Set the polygon action to polygroup, the target to polyloop, and the modifier to checkered. Then we can QMesh polygroup all. Let's go ahead and scale the extruded faces inward. Turn on symmetry in the Z-axis, setting the radial count to 16. From the ZModeler brush, select Slide Edge. Press QC50 and uncrease the interior edges. Slide the outer edges inward. Let's group visible by pressing Ctrl W and slide the edge loop out of it. Set the crease level to 3. Now bring up the gizmo again, select Cylinder 3D from the gear. Snap it to the side view and scale it in the Z-axis. Next, turn on symmetry in the X-axis. Alt-tag the two polys and QMesh them out. Then use masking and the gizmo to modify the shape. Press QC50. Adjust the creasing and inset the flat island. QMesh the polyloop while holding Shift to move. Then we can choose Insert multiple edge loops with interactive elevation. Press QC50 again and adjust the creasing. Now we can grab the Slice Circle brush. Let's go ahead and QMesh the polygroup island. Then crease the edges and adjust the inner polyloop with QMesh. From the ZModeler brush, select Transpose Edge Loop Complete. Press Ctrl W to group visible and set the crease level to 3. Go ahead and press Apply and set the DynaMesh utility to 0.5 for the poly count. For the regular DynaMesh, let's use the picker to set the resolution. Go ahead and weld it in the X-axis and mask the bottom half. Turn on symmetry and grab the Clip Circle Center brush. DynaMesh it again and run a polish. Let's begin by masking your model. Bring up the gizmo and select Cylinder 3D from the gear. Invert the mask and split unmasked points. Snap it to the side view and scale it in the Z-axis. Bring up the gizmo and choose Cylinder 3D from the gear. This time, set the white cone to 0.79. Snap it to the side view and scale it along the Z-axis. Now QMesh the poly loop while holding Shift to move. Let's go ahead and make a few adjustments with the gizmo to get it just right. Let's mask the model again, bring up the gizmo and choose Polysphere from the gear this time. Invert the mask and split unmasked points. Scale it down to the Z-axis and move it up a bit. Let's go ahead and delete the bottom half of your model and adjust the height as needed. Extrude all the polygons and press flip. Unmask the inner poly group and clip it down. Now turn on dynamic. Let's go ahead and delete the edge loop and polygroup the poly loop. Run a polish by features. Then unmask the top poly group and run a relax. Press Crease PG and turn Dynamic back on. Mask the bottom and adjust the height with the gizmo. Run a polish by features a few times until it becomes circular. Then we can scale it up a bit. Finally, unmask the top poly group and mask the edge loop. Run a relax to smooth out any surface deformations.